Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is James Dobbins, who is Director of the Center for International Security and Defense Studies at the RAND Corporation. During the Clinton years, he was a special envoy to many of the hotspots, Haiti, Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, and then in the Bush administration to Afghanistan for a brief period. He is the co-author of a 2-volume set that has appeared over the last 2 years, chronicling American intervention and comparing that intervention with the intervention by the UN over the last several decades. The emphasis being on how do we explain what works in the process of democratization. Ambassador Dobbins, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
Born in New York, raised there for a bit, and then my father worked for the government, and we moved abroad to the Philippines, in fact, when I was about 10, and I went to high school there. And
looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your perspectives on the world?
Well, I think the fact that we did move abroad gave me, obviously, a different experience, led me to choose the Foreign Service as a career, and ultimately led me to the career I had.
Mm-hmm. And where were you educated?
Georgetown.
Georgetown. And did you do any advanced degree work, or did you go right into the Foreign Service?
I, in fact, went right into the Navy and did 3.5 years in the U.S. Navy and then into the Foreign Service.
Mm-hmm. And what were some of your early postings in the Foreign Service?
First posting was in Paris, which was a nice place to start. Downhill from there, but still a nice place to start. And it was an interesting time. I served for a year on the Vietnam peace talks with Averell Harriman and Cyrus Vance were the heads of the delegation. And then I spent the last part of my time there working for Sergeant Shriver, who was the U.S. Ambassador to France at the time.
Mm-hmm. And had you studied Europe and European languages as an undergraduate at Georgetown, or did you acquire these skills later?
No, I hadn't particularly studied Europe. I did a course in international affairs, which was pretty general in nature, and the Foreign Service did teach me French, at least at a very basic level, before sending me to Paris.
Mm-hmm. And so many of your postings in the department after Vietnam and after serving in the embassy were throughout Europe or primarily in France?
Well, I alternated between postings in Washington and postings abroad, but fortuitously, at least I think so, all of my postings abroad, at least for the first 25 years or so, were in Europe. Mm-hmm. In fact, I can say that I never served more than 300 miles from Paris, which was very pleasant places to be.
A real rough duty,
Right.
as we say. And I guess during the time you were serving in these capacities, our relations with Europe were really evolving, and very much so with the end of the Cold War.
When I went to Paris, it was just at the point where de Gaulle had withdrawn Paris from the military elements of NATO. NATO headquarters, which had been in Paris and which were in Paris when I arrived, left and went to Brussels. So there was definitely a difficulty in relationships with France at the time. But in general, and even including France, the Cold War acted as a form of consolidation. It tended to keep the alliance together, and the main focus was on relations with the Soviet Union, how to manage those relationships, and I spent that 25 years working on East-West relations, arms control, political military relations with Europe.
And because I'm intrigued by Europe before we get into this nation building and democracy discussion, because our relations after the fall of the Soviet Union began changing, but it seems after 9/11 we're seeing the dilemmas of what was a very strong and tight partnership as we navigate into this new era. How bad do you think the split is? Will it become worse?
Well, the relationship certainly had its up and downs, and it's always a little dangerous to characterize the latest crisis as one of a irreversible nature. During the Cold War, we had the Suez Crisis, where France and Britain invaded Egypt. The United States threatened economic sanctions. They had to back down. A very difficult time in the relations. There were differences over East-West relations throughout the period. I've already mentioned France pulling out of the military aspects of NATO in the early 60s. And in the aftermath of the Cold War, there was a feeling that the alliance would become irrelevant, that transatlantic relationships would become less central because the Soviet Union had disappeared. There wasn't a unifying threat. And yet, by the end of the 90s, with the civil war in Yugoslavia and NATO action, first in Bosnia and then in Kosovo, the alliance was as solid and as active and as relevant as ever. Then in the aftermath of 9/11, the immediate alliance response was quite good. The Allies invoked Chapter 5 of the NATO Charter and considered the attack on the United States to have been an attack on all of them. But Iraq became an issue between us and our continental allies, at least, an issue which we still haven't gotten over and which became a serious obstacle to transatlantic cooperation. I think it's premature to say, the alliance is finished, it's no longer relevant. We do have to acknowledge this has been one of the most difficult chapters. It does appear to be healing, however.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that we will regret or reaffirm the important role that we have played in the uniting of Europe and the building of the European community?
Well, one of the important aspects of President Bush's most recent trip to Europe was his explicit endorsement of the process of European unification and his explicit statement that the United States continues to believe that a strong, united Europe is in American interests. This has been our traditional policy. The United States was very instrumental in the original establishment of the European community, and it supported each of its progressive steps toward unifying the continent. And it was very important that the President, despite the difficulties of the last couple of years, reaffirmed that position.
The enlargement process seems in a way that the Europeans have chosen not only to increase membership and build a larger and stronger community, but also a way of working at this problem of democratization in a way. By that I mean not that they intervene militarily, but that they in fact set a set of rules, a set of standards that have to be met before new members can join the community. Is that an alternative process in a way for the kinds of things we're going to be talking about in a minute?
Well, it's only an alternative to the extent you're prepared to welcome other societies into your most intimate home, and by and large, it's not a way that's open to the United States. We're not likely to address failed states by inviting them to become the 51st state in the American Union. It is open to Europe, at least on its own periphery, and the process of both NATO and European Union expansion has definitely been an important stabilizing element, and it has channeled the energies of these countries toward both market economies and democratic systems in a remarkably effective way. I think we're reaching near the end. I mean, there are a few countries that are still eligible and with whom the community is still negotiating, mostly in the Balkans. Ukraine is a possibility, but it's so big and so different that it'll be very difficult for the European Union to swallow. The European Union has invited Turkey to begin negotiating for membership. That'll probably take a decade or more, but that will be a major step for the European Union to welcome a Muslim country of 80 million people into its councils. But it is a remarkably successful way of building democratic, market-oriented nations.
So now let's go back to the 90s and ask you what drew you into this shall we call it the failed state portfolio that began to emerge in the 90s with the fall of communism and the changing nature of the international environment? What was it about the end of the Cold War that led to the appearance of this new set of challenges?
Well, I think with the end of the Cold War, the United States had both a new set of challenges and a new set of opportunities. The opportunities were the fact that it was the world's only superpower. It was unconstrained by a peer competitor. It could, in most cases, get international endorsements for its action. It could secure Security Council mandates. And it could normally lead large coalitions. The challenges were that with the aftermath of the Cold War, there were a number of countries that had been held together by Cold War pressures. Countries like Afghanistan or Yugoslavia or Somalia that had been important pieces on the Cold War chessboard, and either the Soviet Union or the United States had acted to try to hold these divided, weak states together. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the Soviet Union lost its capacity to hold these states together, and the United States lost one of its principal incentives. And as a result, we began to see these phenomenon of disintegrating states. Not a new phenomenon, but one that became more acute, but also one about which we could now do something. During the Cold War, American power tended to be used to prevent problems getting worse, not to solve them. And the UN, for that matter, also used force not to solve problems, but to prevent them from becoming a source of East-West conflict. So during the Cold War, Berlin remained divided, Germany remained divided, Europe remained divided, Cyprus remained divided, Palestine remained divided, Korea remained divided, China remained divided, and either American or UN troops were used to maintain those divisions, not to solve the problem, just to stop them getting worse. With the aftermath of the Cold War, it suddenly became possible for the international community to agree on a solution and to use international force, not just to freeze a conflict, but actually to address some of the underlying causes and fix the problem. So you had, in effect, an increase in the demand for nation building as the result of failed states, and you had an increase in supply of nation building because the Security Council of the United Nations could now agree, and the United States, as the world's only superpower, was no longer counterbalanced by a peer competitor, which effectively limited its options.
And in undertaking this new set of tasks, I guess without, I don't intend this in a pejorative way, but the U.S. sort of found its way, fumbled the ball some of the times, but a way to respond began to emerge. Talk a little about that, because in Somalia we got in for humanitarian reasons because of the lack of food supplies and the evidence on the media of starvation. But in Rwanda we didn't respond. So there was a real kind of learning curve going on here.
Yeah, I mean, the America's first experience in modern nation building really began after the Second World War with the occupations of Germany and Japan, and those were very successful. But during the Cold War, as I've suggested, military power tended to be used to freeze problems, not to solve them. By the time the end of the Cold War came, the lessons of Germany and Japan had largely been forgotten. The experiences were too distant to inform current American policy, and so we had to start learning all over again. And we learned through trial and error. Somalia was an almost unmitigated disaster. The lessons we learned there were essentially negative lessons. They were what not to do. We did get progressively better through the 90s. Haiti was a better organized intervention than Somalia, and at least briefly it was more successful, although ultimately it was not a success. Bosnia and Kosovo were better organized still. So there was a learning curve as the same people confronted similar problems, and performance slowly improved. I'm sorry to say this learning curve wasn't sustained into the current decade, and we had to relearn a lot of those lessons again in a trial and error process.
As a put on the hat here of analyst of U.S. foreign policy, stand back from it, and because in your writings and in your two volumes, one really gets a sense of this failure to build and institutionalize this capacity, which is really serious. What is it about our political system, if that's what we can attribute this to, the way we do government, the way we do foreign policy, that has led to a reluctance to build this capacity? Does this only happen when we change administrations, that everything is wiped off the table by the new incoming administration, or is there something more going on here?
Well, I think that there is a tendency when new administrations come in to lose a lot of accumulated knowledge unless that knowledge has been institutionalized in some enduring fashion. The problem in the 90s is that although we were getting better, we weren't regarding these kinds of contingencies as an ongoing and likely permanent necessity. Neither the State Department nor the Defense Department considered nation building among their core competencies. I think the early failure in Somalia made the whole process very controversial. The opposition, political opposition in Washington, was very critical of the whole process. Indeed, the current administration came into office having argued that the Clinton administration confused foreign policy with social work, and that nation building was an inappropriate activity for an American armed forces. So it was a combination of the controversial nature of it, the ambiguous results of the missions that we did launch. The result is that we tended to treat each of them as if it was the first one we had ever done, and we sent new people with new ideas to face old problems. But worse than that, we treated each of them as if it was the last one we were going to do. And as a consequence, once the contingency had been met, we tended to dissipate the expertise. We didn't create an ongoing doctrine. We didn't build a cadre of people with experience who would be available to fill similar positions the next time it became necessary. I think the administration has finally, largely as the result of the early setbacks in Iraq, has learned this lesson, and has both the Defense Department and the State Department are now making a more serious effort to try to institutionalize their knowledge and expertise so that it won't be lost the next time we have a change in administrations.
And I want to be specific about this because I think it's important. It really means that if you don't have an Office of Stabilization, and you have to decide where to locate it, and it has to have a mission, and you have employees who are there to move on to each new situation as it happens and bring a kind of institutional memory. And up until this point in time, although this may be changing now, we haven't gone that far.
There have been any number of initiatives, and some of them have been funded a bit, and some of them have not been funded at all. Congress is reluctant to vote contingency funds. Their attitude is, we'll wait until we have a demonstrable need and then we'll provide the funding, but we're not going to, if we give you a contingency fund, you're going to spend it whether you need it or not. So it's partially that mentality. There's also the difficulty of not knowing who's supposed to do what. the State Department and the Defense Department aren't going to invest in these capabilities unless they know that they will be responsible. And responsibility for a lot of these activities has bounced back and forth from one agency to the other. So nobody's quite sure who is in fact going to be responsible for this or that activity. And as the result, they're reluctant to invest a lot of time, effort, or money in improving that capacity. To the extent that we have a well-understood division of labor, perhaps even one that's set down in legislation, so that people know in these kinds of circumstances what are the State Department's responsibilities, what is the Agency for International Development's responsibilities, what are the Pentagon's responsibilities, where do they overlap, where are they distinct, the agencies may be willing to make the investments which would give them a long-term capacity.
Now, the two volumes that RAND has produced, one looks at U.S. Interventions. The first volume does. Some of the cases we've talked about, even those going far back, Germany and Japan. And the second volume, which was just published, I believe, focuses on UN intervention and so on. And your aim, I gather, was to compare the two, to look at success and failure, and to look at whether there was a way to find mutual goals and which organization, an international organization or the United States, works best under what circumstances. Let's talk a little about that. Before we do that, let's really help people understand what we're talking about when we're talking about nation building and democratization. What do we mean by that?
Well, we define nation building as the use of armed force in the aftermath of a conflict to promote a transition to democracy. So there's three elements. One is that you are using armed force. There's an element of compulsion involved. It's not just democratization. There's a military component to it. Secondly, that it is in the aftermath of a conflict. Now, we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq that some conflicts are more over than others. But in principle, this is a process that begins after the war is over. And thirdly, that your objective is both to ensure that the conflict doesn't break out again, but also to promote a transition to democracy as the best way of ensuring long-term stability in the society concerned. So that's how we define nation building, and it's a relatively new phenomenon. There are some precursors, the German and Japanese occupations at the end of the Second World War, the UN intervention in the Belgian Congo in the 1960s, but nearly all of the cases are post-Cold War cases.
Mm-hmm. And let's briefly talk about Japan and Germany, because those were used a lot as analogies for justifying what we would achieve in Iraq. But in looking at your studies, those were really special cases in the sense that they were homogeneous societies that had known economic development, that were occupied, and that had really been devastated by war.
And had surrendered. And
surrendered, right.
That's right. I mean, I think that the German and Japanese cases are valid models, but to a limited degree. In both cases, they demonstrated that the project is feasible. That is, you can use armed force in the aftermath of a conflict to bring about a transition to democracy, and that the democracy will endure even after the element of compulsion is removed. So it didn't prove you can always do it, but at least it did prove that it could be done. On the other hand, as you've said, there were favorable circumstances in these cases which many of the subsequent nation-building efforts didn't enjoy. Most of the subsequent efforts were not in homogeneous societies, but often in highly divided societies. They've all been in second or third world economies, not first world economies. In many cases, the conflicts haven't actually been formally ended with a surrender. And so for all of those reasons, they were more difficult. I think the administration did prefer to look to Germany and Japan for their models for Iraq. And there were some good reasons for doing that, and there were some bad reasons. The good reasons were that Germany and Japan were big societies. They were big countries, like Iraq, unlike Bosnia or Kosovo, which were fairly small. Secondly, they were unqualifiedly successful, whereas the interventions in the 90s were either failures, Somalia and Haiti, or were at best qualified successes. But the third reason, I think, also had something to do with it, which was those successes had absolutely nothing to do with Bill Clinton. They were politically correct role models, if you will, that could be embraced without embarrassment, because after all, the administration had criticized its predecessor for its roles in the Balkans and therefore was reluctant to now embrace the model. The problem is that Iraq in 2003 looked a lot more like Yugoslavia in 1996 than it did Germany or Japan in 1945. And it probably would have made more sense to look to those later examples for models for involving the UN, multilateralizing the effort, training new police, demobilizing the old army. These were things that had been done repeatedly in the 90s and done successfully in many cases, and they offered more relevant models than much that had occurred in the 1940s.
And you pointed out already that in the first Bush campaign, that is George W. Bush, that he didn't want to do social welfare abroad. He didn't want that a component of his foreign policy. But you also go on to point out in something that you've written that during the Clinton years, I guess we were doing two of these, one of these every 2 years, and now we're doing one every 18 months. So that in a way we're dealing here with the structure of international politics and something that's not going to go away and something that we have to think and plan it for.
Right. I mean, not only has the pace of these operations expanded continuously since the end of the Cold War, but the scale of the operations. During the Cold War, the United States intervened abroad at a rate of about once per decade. So you had Lebanon, the Dominican Republic, Grenada, Panama, about once every 10 years. During the Clinton administration, it went up to almost once every 2 years. And then the current administration, which said it wasn't going to do it anymore, launched 3 new interventions in the first 3 years, into Afghanistan, Iraq, and then back into Haiti again, which indicates that these have become largely unavoidable. And it's likely that there are going to be these kinds of operations in the future. And they're not only getting more frequent, but they're getting larger. The Iraq operation is the largest since the occupations of Germany and Japan in the 1940s.
Now, you point out in your discussion of the Clinton years that what was in place was the Powell Doctrine, which emerged out of the Vietnam War, which emerged out of the Weinberger Pentagon, and then Powell when he was head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which made the argument that if you're going to go into someplace, you oversize your expeditionary force so that you could ensure stability and the security that came with overwhelming military power. Now, in this new administration and the Bush administration, this is an idea that has been dropped because of debates, I gather, within the Pentagon about what kind of military we want in the future. Talk a little about that, because there is an irony here in the sense by using overwhelming power, you seem to be in a better position to secure basic security, which seems to be the key to making the first step successful in the process of democratization, whereas the Rumsfeld notion seems to be, well, you go in with as light a footprint as possible, you win the military victory quickly and devastatingly, and then that's it. But as General Shinketsi pointed out, what we seem to have needed in Iraq was the 400 to 500,000 troops that he predicted. Talk a little about that.
Well, I think in the 1990s, particularly in the aftermath of Somalia, which was very controversial after the Black Hawk went down and the American Rangers were killed, there was a high intolerance for casualties, a certain risk aversion. And as a result, the administration was under strong political pressure to absolutely minimize the number of casualties. And it did that by, in effect, supersizing its interventions, by using such overwhelming force that potential opponents would be intimidated and deterred from even mounting a violent resistance. And that was quite successful. Our study of American interventions did show that there was an inverse relationship between the size of the force as a proportion of the population being stabilized and the number of casualties, with the most generously manned operations in Germany, Bosnia, or Kosovo suffering the fewest casualties. In fact, we've suffered no casualties in Germany after the surrender. We suffered no casualties in Japan after the surrender. We suffered no casualties in Bosnia or Kosovo. Whereas in the interventions which were more economically manned, such as Somalia, and such as Afghanistan and now Iraq, we did suffer higher levels of casualties. And this becomes a serious problem when the civilian population is also suffering high levels of casualties. Because if the civilian population doesn't feel secure by reason of your presence, then they're not likely to commit themselves to you and to the changes you're trying to undertake. So security is a prerequisite for economic and political reforms, and security does ultimately mean that the population has to feel they're safer by reason of your presence.
Mm-hmm. Now, one gets a sense in looking at your two volumes that in a way they complement each other, because they, in some ways, are comparing entirely different cases, different situations on the ground. But when you put them all together, the two volumes, that they point in a direction of, I don't know if we want to call it division of labor, but a way to think about these interventions in terms of timing, who participates, to get the most efficient result, both in economic terms, but also with the political consequences that you're seeking. Talk a little about that.
Well, the first volume deals with the American experience, the second volume with the UN experience. And so we talk about US-led interventions and UN-led interventions. It's artificial in a sense because all of the UN-led interventions had a significant, although not a leading, American role, and all of the US interventions had a significant, although not leading, UN role. So the UN's playing very important roles, for instance, in Iraq and Afghanistan today. And similarly, the United States has supported the UN interventions in East Timor or Sierra Leone or El Salvador or Cambodia or the other places where the UN has been in the lead. Nevertheless, it does make a difference whether the American president or the Secretary General of the United Nations is ultimately in charge, is ultimately making the decisions to commit men and money to an enterprise. And there is American and the United States and the United Nations have developed different styles of nation building. UN missions tend to be smaller, cheaper, quicker. American missions tend to be larger, more expensive. They take longer. UN missions have been quite successful. In fact, among the cases we looked at, they were more successful than the United States. But the US missions tended to be the harder missions. In a number of cases, the U.S. took over missions in which the UN had failed, and therefore the U.S. in effect inherited these failures and tried to turn them around. In Somalia, the U.S. failed as well, but in Bosnia, the U.S. turned around a mission that had failed as a UN mission. In general, the dividing line between the two is that the UN doesn't do invasions. If you're going to have to force entry, if you're not going to be welcomed in, then the UN probably is not the right institution. Similarly, the UN has never really deployed more than 20,000 troops in a single operation. So if the operation either requires an invasion or it requires a force larger than 20,000 men, it's probably going to have to be led by the United States or NATO or perhaps the European Union or some other major power. On the other hand, if it's an operation in which you're not going to have to invade the country to get there, you're going to be invited in, as is normally the case, and in which the force doesn't have to be over 20,000, then the UN is certainly going to be much cheaper than having the United States do it. It has a reasonably high level of success, and it's probably going to be more politically acceptable to the region.
And this is an important point, this last point, because if the Security Council agrees to intervene, you've got a consensus within that body which suggests that you have more legitimacy for what you're about to do. And it also suggests, as you point out, that you're more likely to have the cooperation of the neighboring countries in this operation.
That's true, although I think it's worth remembering that in the post-Cold War era, the only American intervention that did not have a Security Council mandate was Iraq. Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Afghanistan, the U.S. had unified Security Council support for all of those operations. So many U.S. operations have also enjoyed strong international legitimacy. But there's no doubt that with the United States, with the United Nations, it's in effect automatic. If it is a UN operation, it must have had a Security Council mandate, and it's probably going to be less controversial in the region than an American-led intervention. That's not always the case. There are places where the United States has more credibility than the United Nations might. There are instances where an American-led intervention is preferable, not just because it's too hard for the United Nations, but because for one reason or the United Nations has become controversial. For instance, if one were going to put an international peacekeeping force in the Arab-Israeli context in Palestine, for instance, a UN force probably would be unacceptable to the Israelis, and so it would have to be a NATO force, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to the two studies and help our audience understand the kinds of variables that you look at that are measures of what you call input and output, and that is part of the process by which you come to understand these different kinds of interventions.
We actually have three concepts: input, output, and outcome. Input would be how much, it would be basically men, money, and time. How big an intervention force is it? Men. How much money, how much economic assistance are you putting into it? And thirdly, how long are you prepared to commit those resources, over how many years? Outputs are measurable things like how many refugees returned, how many police you're training, those kinds of things. And then outcomes, which is what you're really after, is was the place enduringly peaceful? Did it become democratic? Did it become more prosperous? So you have inputs which you can measure, and you can compare them from one operation to the next. You have outputs which you can measure, but which are interim results, and then you have outcomes which you can also measure in terms of your overall success rate.
You are suggesting, I think, as I recall, that Kosovo was a place where ultimately things came together and involved a more substantial division of labor with a unity of command, that there was a military side and a civilian side, but there was agreement about who should do what and a unified notion about how to go into the future.
Well, Kosovo was the last of the 1990s operation. It was organized by the Clinton administration in its last year of office, at which time the administration had had a substantial experience, as had most of our partners. And so we were able to design a fairly robust structure in which NATO did the military tasks, the United Nations did the political tasks, the European Union did the economic tasks. The United States was able to lead this while contributing only 16% of the money and the troops. So it was very broad burden sharing. Now, the Kosovo operation isn't over. It was an operation that was designed without an exit strategy that's sort of still to be designed. So I don't think you can call it an unqualified success at this point. But I do think it was the most robust structure and the one which had the best burden-sharing elements of any of the 90s operations.
Now, let's take this, this analysis and look again at Iraq and ask what accounts for the way things went wrong. I know you've argued in Foreign Affairs that we lacked the legitimacy of a multinational consensus about what to do, and I believe also you pointed out the weakness of or our vulnerability because of a lack of regional support for what we were doing. And clearly, when one looks at your studies, there was a failure, which we've already talked about, to ensure security on the ground, which might be something that a UN component might do in a better way than we can do.
Well, I think Iraq was always going to be more challenging, more difficult, and more demanding than some of the 90s operations, simply because it's a larger country. In some ways, it's more deeply conflicted internally. It's in a highly sensitive region, so it was never going to be easy. And neither was it going to be possible to replicate exactly the arrangements we had worked out in the 1990s, particularly after the United States decided to intervene, even having failed to get a UN Security Council resolution. It was never going to be possible to simply turn this over to the United Nations after the conventional stage of the conflict was over. Nevertheless, I think that the administration in its planning for Iraq failed to take account of lessons that could have been drawn from the previous decade. They failed to anticipate that the Saddam regime would collapse from one day to the next. They failed to anticipate that the Iraqi security institutions, the army and the police, would either be destroyed, dispersed, or in any case so discredited by the experience that they would not be usable. They failed to anticipate that a combination of criminal and extremist elements would arise virtually overnight, literally overnight, to fill that security vacuum. They failed to anticipate that the Iraqi security forces would not be available to challenge those criminal and extremist elements. They failed to anticipate that if those criminal and extremist elements had an opportunity to fill the security gap, to consolidate their power, to intimidate the population, to begin to gain confidence, then they would become very, very difficult to displace. And finally, they failed to anticipate that American armed forces and coalition armed forces would, from one day to the next, the day the regime collapsed, have to turn from a conventional military conflict to a policing operation in which they would become responsible for public security because there would be no other institutions. And they failed to anticipate that that would impose manpower requirements far in excess of the number of men that were required to overthrow the regime. In testimony before Congress just a few weeks before the war, the administration spokesman said he could not imagine that it would take more men to stabilize Iraq than it would to conquer it. Well, this failure of imagination flew against the experience of the previous decade, wherein it always took more men to stabilize the society than it did to conquer it or gain entry into it. It was air power alone that allowed the United States to put men into Bosnia and Kosovo, and yet we had to put 50 and 60,000 men, respectively, in those two countries in order to stabilize them. In Afghanistan, the war was over. There were only 250 American soldiers in the country. It was air power and the indigenous forces that had won the war, and yet we have 20,000 troops in Afghanistan today trying to stabilize that country. So the experience has always been that it takes more men to stabilize a divided, fractured, failed state than it does to actually gain entry into the country. And so it was those failures to anticipate that that caused the initial loss of control and a loss of ground that we are still trying to make up.
Now, do you think that this, how do we politically explain this failure to imagine a big chunk of the problem that we were going to have on your table once you intervened? Was this about the debate? Do we partly account for this because of the debate within the Pentagon between Rumsfeld and his generals about what the military should look like, so that he was so focused on winning with a force that was small in order to show that this was the wave of the future? Or is that just overstating where they were coming from?
Well, the debate over transformation may have had a role in this. Certainly, certainly this administration has been eager to demonstrate, to argue that small, agile, highly equipped forces could win victories more quickly at lower cost and with a fewer number of troops, provided they had the right communications and other networks and sophisticated systems that could find, track, and destroy targets. And they demonstrated that quite effectively, first in Afghanistan and later in Iraq. That may have been an element in this, but I think that there were probably other strands as well. I think that the disinclination to look to lessons of the 90s, because they had been so critical over those activities when they'd been in opposition, also made it difficult for them to draw positive lessons from those experiences. It's a natural human phenomenon. Also, quite frankly, if one had objectively looked at the likely costs of the Iraq operation and had acknowledged those costs, it would have been very difficult to secure congressional and public support for the operation. Mm-hmm. Our first volume, which was written as the build-up to the war took place, suggested that it might take as many as 400,000 troops and $18 billion a year to stabilize Iraq, numbers which seemed astronomical at the time, and we ourselves wondered whether these could sustain an argument. Now, it turns out that, for instance, the $18 billion we predicted, which seemed staggering, was exactly the amount of money the administration asked for the first year. I mean, it was almost unbelievable that we hit it, the nail on the head quite so precisely. The 400,000, well, if you look at the number of Iraqi troops we're trying to train at the moment, and you add the number of American and coalition troops there, you do get to 400,000. So it is ultimately going to take 400,000 men to stabilize Iraq. So the numbers, in retrospect, don't seem that far off, but they seemed very big at the time. Even to us as authors of the volume, they seemed pretty staggering. I think if there had been an acknowledgement that these were indeed the figures, it would have made people much more cautious about the enterprise.
If we take your two volumes and look at them side by side, one gets the sense that hope for the future, if God forbid these kinds of situations arise in other parts of the world, that it's a synergy between these two models working together that offers the best possibilities. Now, of course, such a solution requires an acceptance of a multilateral way of approaching the world and not a unilateral one. So the other petard that the Bush administration seems to have been foisted on is the fact that their way of doing this, both, that is, doing Iraq, both with regard to the American domestic political system. We're going to do this, and we're going to move on it, and we're not going to have the debate, is one way to look at that picture. But then with regard to the UN and a history of sort of putting aside multilateral agreements, there's a real thrust here that leads you to the conclusion that had your reports been written, they wouldn't have influenced the administration if they had been written, in an earlier period where they could sit and study them before they decided to do Iraq?
Well, I think that although the administration hasn't been particularly ready to acknowledge mistakes, it's been fairly quick to correct some of them. And I think they've moved away from the unilateralist approaches which characterized policy for the first few years. I think the costs of the Iraq operation have been very sobering. I tend to think that we hit the limits of unilateralism in about November of 2003. That was the point at which we invited the UN back into Iraq to help us constitute an Iraqi government. That was the point at which we decided to end the occupation and turn power back over to Iraqis. And I think this is the point at which we asked NATO to play a bigger role in both Afghanistan and Iraq. I think people realized that we tried the unilateral approach and it just wasn't getting us where we wanted to go, that we needed a greater level of burden sharing. And I see the administration moving in that direction, not necessarily acknowledging that it made mistakes, but implicitly altering course.
If we look at your experience over the years, from you starting off with the negotiations in Paris to end the Vietnam War, a lot of experience in Europe where diplomacy and civility must be at its highest, but then in these later years looking at how to solve some of the problems of some of really the basket cases. I'm curious, what skills do you think are really important in understanding the world and understanding these kinds of problems and America's place in the world, where it has more power than anybody else, but in some ways less power than it had?
Well, it takes a lot of skills, and it takes a lot of combination of skills, and probably no one person has them all. I think that that an effective diplomat needs, first of all, an understanding of how power is distributed in other societies and how decisions are made, who actually makes the decision, on what basis do they make them, what inputs are important to them. That's a prerequisite for influencing the system, is understanding how that system works. The second is an ability to establish relationships of confidence, even with potential adversaries, in which you establish a relationship in which each party sees a self-interest in being reasonably candid, reasonably straightforward, and in working through a problem, ideally to an agreed solution. That's often a lot more possible than one might originally accept. So it's partially, I think the two things you need are, first of all, an understanding of how power is effectively distributed and managed in another society, and secondly, a certain empathy for your interlocutors. Where are they coming from? What's important to them? How to shape your arguments in a manner which is likely to appeal to them and change their mind.
Do you feel confident that that American domestic politics will provide a foundation for America playing the strategic role it has played in the past, but also being able to understand when and if multilateral solutions are appropriate?
Well, of course, America is so powerful that multilateralism doesn't come naturally. If you're a small country in a big world, you rapidly come to see the necessity for working through multilateral institutions. A big country which has so much power and capacity to achieve things nationally or within small coalitions is harder to persuade. And so it does take sobering experiences like our experience in Iraq to remind people that even the world's only superpower has considerable limitations. The United States also has more difficulty institutionalizing these kinds of lessons, because our patronage system creates such a huge turnover of personnel. Most democratic governments, when they change administrations from one party to another, there are perhaps 50 or 100 people who leave their office and another 50 or 100 people come into the office. In the United States, you're talking about 10, 20,000 people who change. I mean, it's a staggering number. And as the result, particularly in institutions like the White House, there's virtually nobody left, and the file drawers are empty. A new team comes in, and then there's a process during which they learn lessons. Sometimes that's quick and painless, but often it's not so quick, and it's very painful, and it's very costly. The advantage of the system is that it makes the connection between the citizen and the government stronger. People come from all over the country, they move to Washington. It's not just an elite of bureaucrats and politicians who are governing from a distance. But the disadvantage is that when we change, particularly when we change both parties and administrations, there is often a prolonged vacuum of experience, which can lead to costly errors.
I know at RAND, the center that you're heading is focused on really an array of security issues beyond the ones that we've just talked about. And this would require a short answer, but is there some way that we should be conceptualizing what the security threats are that thus far we have not done as a country, or are we moving in the right directions?
I think that there's a tendency to oversimplify. A lot of people have suggested 9/11 was a fundamental watershed, that everything has changed, and that the threat is now Muslim jihadism and weapons of mass destruction. Those are certainly threats, but the world isn't that different, and a more sophisticated and reflective understanding of the world would lead less to the assumption that everything has changed, everything is new, and none of the old solutions work. I tend to think that the world changes a little more slowly, and I was pleased to see that the president in his inaugural address spoke more about democratization and less about counterterrorism. Now, there's a lot of oversimplifications in that inaugural address, but what it means is we now have a foreign policy based on hope, whereas prior to the president's inaugural, we had a foreign policy based on fear. And all in all, I'd rather have a foreign policy based on hope than fear.
Ambassador Dobbins, on that note, I want to thank you very much for coming to the Berkeley campus and participating in our program today, and sharing with us this very interesting odyssey and the ideas that are going to matter in our U.S. foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.